In Chapter 14, we're going to be discussing groups for older adults. So the older adult population, meaning anyone from about age 60 until the end of the lifespan, is one of the growing and larger groups in the United States currently. And so what we know is that as what we call the baby boomer generation begins to age, and people generally are starting to live longer than they ever have before, we see in the healthcare field a lot of changes in more needs around seniors and around older adults, and the need for services from professional counselors in older adults, and also potentially for our school folks. We do see instances of grandparents or older adults raising children, or serving as foster parents for children, or kinship care. And so even in the school setting, we might see interactions with older adults, or a need for maybe groups around older adult caregivers for younger children. So older adults are a population that I think sometimes are an afterthought, but there really is a lot of need and a lot of clients out there needing services from mental health professionals right now, which is why we see generally our profession advocating for things like Medicare coverage, because older adults, older adult veterans, and older adults in general are needing a lot more mental health care and supports as that population continues to grow in our country. So looking at older adults, the different types of groups that might be useful, of course, psychoeducational groups. There are a lot of different kinds of life transitions that are happening, especially around things like physical illness or medication management, and a lot of opportunities for psychoeducation around retirement and engaging in the community, and just knowledge around different kinds of health issues. And so we see a lot of psychoeducational groups being offered for older adults, and especially in university communities. There are a lot of opportunities to offer psychoeducational groups around different kinds of health issues for older adults and seniors. We do see some advocacy happening currently from the counseling community, but also the AARP, which often are called the Gray Panthers. And lately they've been very vocal advocates for this idea of Medicare coverage for professional counselors, because they recognize that this population needs a lot of help and support, and there just aren't enough providers out there to be able to provide those services under the Medicare coverage that they currently have. And so we do see, for example, task groups around advocacy for this population and their healthcare needs. And then in terms of counseling and psychotherapy, I'm sure you can imagine that there are a lot of different kinds of life transitions, a lot of grief-related issues, a lot of different things that are happening in older adulthood that could provide common ground to create a counseling or psychotherapy-related group. We, of course, have severe mental illness and developmental disability issues that are present throughout the lifespan and continue to need those supports for individuals as they are getting into older adulthood. But also we see a lot of things around retirement, transitioning out of the world of work. We see grief, we see difficulty in transitions with family-related issues, children becoming adults, and the changes that go along with adult children establishing their own life spaces, and where do you fit into all of that. Relationships are just as much of an issue, especially where we're seeing individuals who are widows or widowers trying to figure out how to engage in different kinds of relationships. Sexuality and intimacy is actually a huge issue for the older adult population, and that's not something that we think about. But for example, in retirement communities, in recent years, we've seen large spikes in sexually transmitted illnesses, because older adults just are not having conversations around sexuality and how to be safe in sexuality and how to engage in relationships with people and start relationships with people in older adulthood, especially after you've been married or are a widower or divorced, and starting to figure out how to navigate those kinds of transitions as an older adult. So there are lots of different kinds of counseling groups that are just as relevant for older adult crowds as the rest of the lifespan. So, in looking at counseling and psychotherapy, it's useful to use reality oriented groups. And so, you might have groups that are specifically around mindfulness or grounding techniques, especially for individuals who are starting to experience dementia, but also just typical forgetfulness or memory loss that comes with older age. There are a lot of wellness based groups specifically around memory care or around neurological wellness. We see a lot of growth in using mindfulness with the older adult population just to help with, there's a lot of neurobiological benefits to using mindfulness. And so we see that with older adult populations as well, around body awareness and breathing and grounding techniques and connection with others and with the world around you. And then also looking at therapy groups, helping older adults transition out of the world of work and becoming invested in not just their own personal future and their own personal place in the community, but generally in that generativity stage. So looking at how you can contribute to making a better world for the population that's coming and growing and developing after you, for your children and for others that are younger and inheriting the world. So it can be useful, as we know, in that Erikson stage, to introduce groups that are around kind of creating a positive impact in your community and how to do that and how to kind of leave your mark on your world that you're in. Also looking at life review. So taking some time to really experience and resolve conflicts that have been going on earlier in the lifespan. Again, we see childhood trauma coming up again and again and again throughout the lifespan, but also reconciling with things like divorce and things like loss of a child and things like different kinds of transitions or any kind of unresolved conflicts or difficulties that you've navigated earlier in your life tends to come up again later in life. And so having these life review groups is really useful because it gives individuals, especially now that they may be transitioning out of the world of work and have maybe a little more time and mental space to dedicate to processing those kinds of things, you can go and kind of make your peace and come to a healthy place and acceptance of things that maybe have happened in your past that you didn't have the opportunity to reconcile earlier. So for older adults, in terms of counseling and therapy groups, just some examples of some different ways that you can focus a group or some different topics that might be relevant. So naturally, role changes. So of course we talk about identity in career, and so this idea of retirement or transitioning out of the world of work, or wishing that you could transition out of the world of work but not being able to because of different things that have happened throughout the lifespan. I think we're seeing now more frequently older adults who are struggling with not being able to retire because of the economy and because of different circumstances and not being able to save for retirement in the way that they wanted to, or different circumstances in some way getting in the way of that ability to retire and transition out of the world of work. Also looking at like changes in relationship status, changes in the role of parenting as children get older, role changes in becoming grandparents potentially, or great aunts or great uncles. And so there are a lot of different role changes that happen with relationships and individuals as you age. Ageism, so this idea of as you get older that you're feeling as if you were a burden on others, or perhaps feeling that you're not given the same opportunities, especially if you're in a place where you're not able to transition out of the world of work. Ageism is a huge thing that needs to be processed and supported. And this idea of feeling obsolete or not useful to others. We also see social isolation, and so we see as children are growing into older adults, or having their own children, they may not have as much connection with their families of origin. In transitioning out of the world of work, work is often where we find a lot of social connections kind of naturally because we're all in the same space. And so when you take that out of the picture and individuals may be experiencing health-related issues or may not be able to drive, there's a lot of social isolation that happens. You lose a lot of those natural avenues for social connection that you had prior to becoming an older adult. And so sometimes just having groups specifically to get people together and to give them something productive to do with their time once a week is really important. Also, a lot of grief and loss comes up at this point in the lifespan. Seeing a lot of spouses or friends or others passing. It's just becoming the point of your life where everyone else that has appeared to you is also becoming an older adult, and so you just start to experience more loss and more grief experiences as you age. Struggling with this idea of your body not working in the same way that it used to, and not being able to do things that you used to enjoy doing, or maybe not doing them in the same kind of way, can be really difficult. And with older adults, we see that triggering a lot of depression, a lot of anxiety, a lot of feeling trapped in this body that just doesn't work. And then fear of the future, but also in this idea of kind of coming to terms with this idea of the end of your lifespan and coming to a place of acceptance and understanding of what that means for you. Some more examples for older adults. A lot of topics and themes that are popular or useful are loss of a spouse, so widows and widowers, and what is that like, and how do you, especially if it's been a marriage that's lasted most of your life, how do you navigate and transition this new stage of your development on your own without this person that you're used to depending on? Sexuality, which we've talked about, health-related issues, either in a psychoeducational context, but also in a support and counseling kind of context. Parenting grandchildren, which we also touched on already, as we're seeing a lot of older adults having to step into parenting or kinship care roles. And so when you're in this stage where you were not expecting to have to fill that role anymore, what kind of supports are necessary for you? Spirituality is really important with this population, especially in reconciling and thinking about the end of your own life process. Spirituality becomes very important. And then there's a lot of supports and a lot of research out there that advocate for use of art and bibliotherapy and different creative kind of ways of connecting with clients when you're working with older adults. Just it helps with the cognitive process. There's a lot of biological benefits to that, and it stimulates their cognitive abilities in ways that are useful as you're starting to see maybe some of those decline, or you're starting to see the beginnings of different types of dementia and things like that. Psychotherapy, so thinking about different kinds of contexts, you might see groups being offered in hospitals, in retirement communities, in hospice care, in skilled nursing communities. And so thinking about where these clients are, and especially thinking about access for these clients, because a lot of them may not drive, may not have access to reliable transportation. And so how do we get these individuals to the groups as they need them around things like grief, around understanding what hospice is, around understanding end-of-life care, and again, making sure that we're never wandering outside of our scope of practice. I would never want to give someone advice about making arrangements for end-of-life care, but we can certainly process what it's like for them to have to consider that possibility. Another kind of interesting example that's more of a modern development is this idea of e-groups. And so we see a lot of baby boomers and a lot of older adults who might struggle with technology tools that could actually be really useful for them in the way that they navigate the world. We've seen things like FaceTime become a really useful tool for individuals, especially if they're geographically isolated from their family. You can still connect with others, you can still see them, you can still see what they're doing, using things like email or Facebook or Instagram to be able to connect with others that you love and see what they're doing and be connected with the world. And so these groups called e-groups are created as opportunities to teach older adults how to use these technology tools in ways that allow them to connect with the world from their home if they're not able to go out or travel or be near others. And so sometimes that training is necessary, And so these groups can be created to help train older adults in how to use those tools, and then talking about using them as coping skills for things like depression, anxiety, loneliness, and isolation. So with older adults as the leader, thinking about navigating different areas of the lifespan, you, of course, with any other group, would want to consider the type of group you're leading and the individuals who are going to be screened into it and out of it, and how it's going to be conducted, the type of activities that you might want to use. In the case of older adults especially, you want to think about things like accessibility, and making sure that the activities that you plan are going to be physically accessible for adults, especially considering certain types of groups that you might be, groups of people you might be recruiting to come into your counseling group. And so making sure that everything you're doing is going to be appropriate and provide the opportunity for everyone to participate equally. Also thinking about readiness. So especially if you're working in memory care or hospice, people have different kinds of energy levels or different kinds of coherence on different days. And so maybe being ready to adapt if needed, considering what's going on with your clients on each day, because it could be very different each time that the group meets. And so we see, even if this isn't the specific purpose of your group, remembering that loss and loneliness are really common and might come up regardless of your purpose in your group. Death and dying are always something that are often talked about. Physical changes in health, increased dependency on others. This can be really hard. Getting to a place in your life where you're not able to be independent anymore is difficult. And so even if you're leading a psychoeducational group about something completely unrelated, these themes might come up. Relationships with children, this role of grandparenting in different kinds of ways. And then finding new hobbies, new ways to keep busy, new types of activities to participate in that are going to be physically accessible, and also appropriate and allow you to connect with new social groups.